William Gray stood by the window, gazing out at the city lights. His office was high up in a gleaming skyscraper, offering a perfect view of the bustling world below. To anyone who looked at him from the outside, William had everything. He was wealthy, powerful, and respected. But in that moment, he felt nothing but emptiness. For years, he had worked tirelessly to build his business empire, making sacrifices along the way. He had once been filled with ambition, driven by the desire to succeed, to prove himself to everyone around him. But as his business grew, so did the distance between him and his family. Laura, his wife of 15 years, had always been there for him. She was the steady force in his life, the one who supported him during the hard times and cheered for him when things went well. She had given him everything he could have asked for: a home, children, love. But over time, something had changed. It wasn't that William didn't love Laura anymore. He did, in his own way. But he couldn't help but feel trapped. Every day was the same routine: meetings, calls, long hours at the office. It had all become too predictable, too suffocating. He had built an empire, but he had lost sight of what truly mattered. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door closing downstairs. He knew that Laura had just come home. He could hear her footsteps as she walked into the kitchen, the soft sound of the refrigerator door opening. She was busy preparing dinner, just as she always did. But something inside William snapped. The life he had once dreamed of now felt like a cage. He had spent so many years building his career, but in the process, he had neglected the family he had promised to care for. The thought of being tied down, of spending another evening in a life he had grown to resent, was more than he could bear. He stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of his decision. He knew it wasn't fair to Laura or to their two young children, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was suffocating. The career he had worked so hard to build had become a prison, and the only way out was to walk away. William's hands trembled as he picked up his keys and grabbed a suitcase from the closet. He didn't have a plan, but he knew that leaving was the only choice he had left. He needed space. He needed freedom. He needed to be alone. As he walked toward the door, he paused. For just a moment, he thought about the family he was leaving behind. He thought about Laura, her bright smile, the way she had always supported him, even when he didn't deserve it. He thought about his children, the little faces that looked up to him, trusting him to always be there. But the thought of another night in the same routine, the same life, was too much to bear. He turned the doorknob and stepped outside, not looking back. The air outside was cool, and as he walked down the street toward his car, he felt a strange sense of relief. It was as if he had been holding his breath for years and finally exhaled. But the relief was quickly replaced by guilt, and with it came a realization he couldn't ignore. He had just made a decision that would change everything. As he drove away, William tried to silence the voice in his head telling him he had made a mistake. He told himself he needed to do this for himself, that he needed to find his own path again. But deep down, a part of him knew that the life he was leaving behind would never be the same. And so, with every mile that passed between him and his family, William took the first step down a path he couldn't undo. After William left, life for Laura seemed to stop in a way. She sat at home in the evenings, staring at the empty chair across from her at the dinner table. For years, that chair had been filled by William, her husband, her partner. But now, it was just empty, a reminder of the man who had walked out without a word. She had always known that William's business was important to him. She had supported him in every way she could. She raised their two children, worked hard to keep their home running smoothly, and made sure the family was always cared for. But when he left, all of that changed. Laura did her best to stay strong, but the weight of everything was overwhelming. She had to keep going. She had two children to care for, Ethan and Emily, and they needed her more than ever. But deep down, she struggled with the questions that never seemed to go away. Why had William left? Why had he abandoned them without any explanation? Days turned into weeks, and then months. William didn't call. He didn't write. There was no sign of him, no indication that he even cared about the family he had walked away from. Laura felt like she was living in a fog, trying to go through the motions of life, but never quite able to shake the sadness that hung over her. But life didn't stop. The bills still had to be paid. The kids still had to be fed, clothed, and taken care of. So Laura worked harder than ever, taking on a part-time job in the evenings as a secretary for a local law firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. She had learned to be resourceful, using every skill she had to keep things together for her children. Ethan and Emily were young when William left. Ethan, the older of the two, was quiet and thoughtful. He asked about his father sometimes, but Laura always answered as gently as she could. "Daddy had to go away for a while," she would say. "But you are loved, and that's what matters." Emily, on the other hand, was a firecracker. She never seemed to let anything get her down for long. She had her mother's strength and her father's smile. Even though she missed William, she never showed it as much as Ethan did. As the years went by, Laura grew accustomed to the silence in the house. There were no more late-night conversations with William, no more shared plans for the future. The days were long, but they were filled with purpose. The children were her focus, and she gave them everything she had. Still, William's absence left a deep hole in Laura's heart. She could feel it when she looked at their wedding photos, when she walked past the places they had once visited together. There were no answers, no closure, just a deep ache that lingered. One evening after a long day at work, Laura sat down on the couch and picked up a photo album. It was from their early years together, before the business had consumed William's time. She looked at the pictures of their wedding, their first home, their children's first birthdays. It all seemed so distant now, like a lifetime ago. Laura closed the album with a sigh and leaned back on the couch. She had done everything she could to move forward, but sometimes the weight of what had happened would hit her like a wave. She missed William, but more than that, she missed the man he used to be. The man who had once promised to build a life together with her and their children. But life, as always, moved forward. Ethan and Emily were growing up, and Laura did everything she could to be the best mother she could be. She didn't have time to dwell on the past. She had a new future to create, one that didn't include the man who had walked out on them. Yet, as much as she had tried to move on, she couldn't shake the feeling that someday the man who had left them would come back into their lives. But would it be too late to fix what he had broken? Years passed, and life began to settle into a rhythm for Laura and the children. Ethan was now in high school, a quiet and thoughtful young man who had learned to take care of things around the house. Emily, with her lively energy and sharp wit, was thriving in middle school, always keeping Laura on her toes. Both children had grown into strong, independent individuals, and Laura couldn't have been prouder. She had worked hard to give them a good life, despite everything that had happened. But even as time moved forward, something deep inside Laura always wondered about William. Why had he left? Would he ever come back? Was he out there somewhere, living a life without her and their children? The questions haunted her, though she rarely spoke them aloud. It was as if the past had woven itself into the fabric of their lives, a quiet reminder of something that had been lost. Then, one rainy afternoon, as Laura was cleaning out some old papers, something unusual arrived. A letter. It was from a law firm she didn't recognize, and it was addressed to her, though there was no return address. Opening it with a mix of curiosity and caution, Laura found a letter informing her of a distant relative's passing and a small inheritance that had been left to her and the children. The letter went on to explain that this inheritance was tied to a property, and they would need to attend a meeting to finalize the details. Laura's heart raced for a moment, wondering if this was some kind of mistake. But as she looked at the letter again, something caught her attention. The name of the property owner, Richard Gray, sounded familiar. Her mind raced back to the days when she and William were still together. Richard Gray was William's distant cousin, someone Laura had heard about but never met. At the time, she didn't pay much attention to him. Now, it seemed his death had somehow tied her and her children back to a part of William's world she thought she had left behind. I don't know what this is about, Laura murmured to herself. She thought about calling the lawyer, but decided against it. Instead, she put the letter aside for a moment and focused on the immediate needs of her children. They didn't need to be bothered by any of this now. But a part of her couldn't let go of the strange coincidence. It was as if the past had crept back into their lives, quietly and unexpectedly. Laura decided to attend the meeting alone, figuring it would be easier to sort things out without involving the children just yet. The following week, she drove to the law office, feeling a little nervous about what was ahead. When she entered the office, she was greeted by a friendly receptionist who led her to a small, quiet room. The lawyer, a middle-aged man with glasses, soon joined her and began explaining the details of the inheritance. "What I don't understand," the lawyer began, "is the unusual connection between the inheritance and the estate. You see, the property owner, Richard Gray, had left a note stating that this estate was meant to be shared by multiple individuals, but his wishes were unclear. It appears that there are 4 other people who are also entitled to a part of the inheritance." Laura's heart skipped a beat. 4 people. She had no idea what this could mean. "What do you mean by 4 other people?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The lawyer paused, then slid a folder across the table. "We've done some research, and these 4 individuals, each of them unrelated to you, have all come forward with claims to part of the estate. They are all connected to Richard Gray's will." Laura opened the folder and gasped. There, printed on the page, were photographs of the 4 individuals, a group of men, all in their 20s, all with remarkably similar faces. She blinked in shock as she looked at the faces in the photographs. They looked almost identical to William, each one sharing his sharp features, his dark hair, and his intense blue eyes. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Her mind raced with the question she had tried to bury for so long. Could these be his children? Laura sat at the small conference table, the lawyer's voice a distant hum in the background, as she stared at the photographs of the 4 young men. Their faces were so similar to William's that she couldn't stop herself from studying each one closely, trying to find any sign of a difference. It was as if time had folded, bringing back memories of a past she had spent years trying to forget. She felt like she was in a dream, unsure whether to believe what she was seeing. "I understand this is difficult to grasp," the lawyer said, his voice soft but firm. "But these 4 individuals claim to be connected to the Gray estate, and based on our research, they do seem to have a legitimate claim." Laura blinked, trying to focus. "I don't understand. How could they be connected to Richard Gray? What does this have to do with me or my children?" The lawyer cleared his throat. "Well, that's where it gets complicated. They don't appear to be related to Richard Gray directly, but they all share a very important connection. They are all, by some means, connected to William Gray." The name hit Laura like a shockwave. "William?" she whispered, almost to herself. "How?" The lawyer nodded. "It appears these 4 individuals were all born around the same time. After an investigation, we found that there was a mix-up involving a medical procedure, a procedure that, unknown to anyone at the time, could have resulted in the birth of multiple children." Laura's head spun. She tried to keep her voice steady. "Are you saying these men are my husband's children?" The lawyer nodded. "Yes, that's what the evidence suggests." A cold shiver ran down Laura's spine. How could this be happening? William had left so many years ago, and now, out of nowhere, she was confronted with the idea that there were other children, 4 of them, who shared his face. It felt unreal, like some twisted twist of fate. She sat in stunned silence, processing everything that had just been revealed. "What do we do now?" Laura asked quietly, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The lawyer handed her a letter, one that had been left behind by Richard Gray. "It seems these 4 men are not only connected by their appearance, but also by some kind of strange legal arrangement. Richard Gray's will states that the inheritance is to be shared among them, but there is no clear explanation as to why. Laura's mind raced. But why now? Why would this happen after all these years? What does William have to do with any of this? The lawyer leaned forward. That's what we need to figure out. These four men, Ethan, Michael, Jacob, and Lucas, are not aware of each other, but they all began looking into their family history after discovering that their lives shared many similarities. It's all very confusing. After a long pause, the lawyer added, "They will be here soon. They're coming to meet you." Laura felt her heart race. She had no idea what to expect when she met them, but the idea of seeing four strangers who looked so much like her husband, who looked like her children's father, was overwhelming. She had spent so many years trying to forget William, trying to move on from the man who had walked away. But now, she was about to meet four people who would force her to confront the past in a way she never expected. The door to the conference room opened, and in walked the four men. They were all tall, with the same dark hair, the same sharp features, and the same deep blue eyes. The moment they stepped into the room, Laura's breath caught in her throat. They introduced themselves, one by one. Ethan, Michael, Jacob, and Lucas. Each one seemed as surprised as she was, their faces a mixture of confusion and curiosity. They had all been told the same thing, that they had a connection to William Gray, but none of them had expected to meet his wife. "I never imagined meeting anyone who knew him," Ethan said quietly, looking at Laura with a mix of emotions. I never knew where I came from." Laura looked at them, her mind racing. These four men were all strangers to her, yet they shared so much of the man she once loved. How could this be? And what was she supposed to do now? For the first time in years, she felt a spark of hope mixed with the pain of the past. Perhaps this strange twist of fate wasn't just a coincidence. Maybe, just maybe, these four strangers could help her find the answers she had been searching for all along. The room was filled with quiet tension as Laura sat facing the four young men. Ethan, Michael, Jacob, and Lucas, all of them so similar to each other, and to William. They were strangers, yet they felt oddly familiar. Their faces, their voices, the way they spoke, it was as if they had stepped right out of her past, forcing her to face the part of her life she had tried to leave behind. Laura cleared her throat, trying to gather her thoughts. "I don't know what to say. This is a lot to take in," she began, her voice shaking slightly. Ethan, the oldest of the four, nodded. "We understand. It's a lot for us too." He looked at Laura with a mix of curiosity and sadness. "We all grew up without knowing anything about our father. We knew we were connected somehow, but none of us expected this." Laura tried to steady herself, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "I don't understand how this could have happened," she said quietly. "William, he left us without any explanation. Why didn't he ever come back?" Michael, who had been quiet up until that point, spoke up. "We've all had questions like that. We were raised by different families, and none of us ever knew the others existed. We all found out about the connection to William through, well, strange circumstances, but what I want to know is why he left." The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. Laura's mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything. She had spent so many years moving forward, raising her children, trying to rebuild a life without William. Now here were these men, these sons, who looked like him in every way, forcing her to relive the pain of his sudden departure. "I don't know," she said softly, her eyes filling with tears. "He never gave me a reason. One day he was there, and the next he was gone. He didn't look back. It was as if we never mattered to him." Lucas, who had been sitting with his arms crossed, spoke gently. "I know it must be hard for you. It's hard for all of us. We didn't ask for this. None of us asked for a life without a father, and it's taken us years to understand what happened. But now we have answers. We know we're connected to him somehow, and that's why we're here." Laura wiped her eyes, trying to keep her composure. I never imagined this. All these years, I've tried to move on. I thought William had moved on too. But now, I don't know what to think. You four are. You're all a part of him. And it feels like I'm being pulled back into a past I've tried so hard to leave. Ethan leaned forward, his voice filled with understanding. We're not here to force anything on you. We don't expect you to just accept us. But we need answers too. We need to understand why our father made the choices he did. And maybe you have some of those answers. The room fell silent again. Laura felt as though she were drowning in a flood of emotions. Anger, sadness, confusion. She had always thought that her life after William would be just that, her life. But now, it seemed like the past was reaching out and pulling her back into something she had no control over. Finally, Laura spoke, her voice quiet but firm. I can't change what happened. I can't change what he did. But I'll tell you everything I know. I'll tell you about the man I married, the father he was, and why I think he left. If that helps you find peace, then I'll do it. The four men looked at each other, a mixture of relief and gratitude in their eyes. They weren't asking Laura to forgive them, nor were they expecting any promises. But in that moment, they had found something important, a starting point. We need to know everything, Michael said quietly. We need to know who we are, where we come from. Laura nodded, her voice shaking. I'll help you. I'll help you understand who he was, even if it's painful for me. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't closure. But it was the beginning of something. A chance for all of them to understand the truth. It was a painful road, one filled with questions that might never be fully answered. But at least now, they were facing it together. After the meeting, Laura found herself overwhelmed by everything that had been revealed. For years, she had lived with the question of why William had left. And now, sitting in front of four men who shared his face, the question seemed even more complicated. She couldn't stop thinking about the strange connection between them all, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the answers she needed were just out of reach. The four young men had left, but their presence still lingered in Laura's mind. She could still see their faces, their shock and confusion when they first met her. They didn't have answers, just the same questions she had been asking for so long. Why had William walked away? Why had he never come back? Over the next few days, Laura couldn't stop thinking about them. She tried to keep herself busy, taking care of the house, spending time with Ethan and Emily, and going to work. But the questions were always there, gnawing at her. She hadn't told her children yet about the meeting where the strangers who claimed to be their half-brothers. She wasn't sure how to explain it, or even what to say. Ethan had noticed her distraction. Mom, what's going on? He asked one evening, sitting down beside her on the couch. You've been really quiet lately. Laura looked at her son, who had grown into a thoughtful young man. She could see the worry in his eyes, and for a moment, she felt guilty for not being more open with him. She had always tried to protect him from the pain of William's departure, but now it seemed like that was no longer possible. There's something I need to tell you, she began, her voice trembling slightly. Remember how your father just left? Well, there's more to it than I've ever told you. Something happened, and there are 4 men out there who claim to be your father's children. Ethan's eyes widened. What? 4? Laura nodded. Yes, they all look like him. And they say they were raised by different families, without knowing anything about each other. They've all discovered their connection to William, and they're trying to make sense of it all. Ethan sat back, his mind racing. How is that possible? And why didn't you ever tell me about this before? Laura took a deep breath, trying to explain. I never knew how to tell you. When William left, I thought it was over. I didn't want you to think about him or wonder why he wasn't here. But now these men are here, and I have to face the truth. Ethan remained silent for a long time, clearly processing everything. Finally, he spoke. So what happens now? What do we do? I don't know, Laura admitted. I'm still trying to figure it out. All I know is that this is a part of our past we can't ignore. I don't have all the answers, but I'm going to find them. We have to face this together." Later that week, the four men contacted Laura again, this time asking if they could meet once more. They explained that they had done some digging into their pasts and discovered even more startling information. Their connection to William wasn't just a simple mix-up. It seemed there had been some sort of medical error that had caused multiple embryos to be implanted, leading to the birth of all four of them. It wasn't something anyone had planned, but it had happened, and now they were all trying to understand the truth. Laura felt a knot form in her stomach. The more she learned, the more complicated everything seemed. The fact that William had left, and now there were four others who shared his blood, made it hard to know what to feel. She felt anger, confusion, and even a strange sense of guilt. Was this all her fault? Could she have done something differently? The more she spoke to the men, the more it became clear that they, too, were struggling. Ethan, Michael, Jacob, and Lucas all had their own versions of growing up without a father, and now they were searching for answers that felt impossible to find. "I don't know what to do anymore," Laura said one evening, speaking to herself as much as to the room. "There are so many pieces to this puzzle, and I can't see the whole picture." The truth was, none of them could. But as Laura looked at the four men who shared William's face, she realized that maybe, just maybe, they were the key to understanding everything. They had questions, just like she did. And together, perhaps they could find the answers that had been buried for so long. The next meeting with the four young men was set for the following week. Laura wasn't sure what to expect. She had barely begun to process the weight of the situation herself, but she knew that it was time to face it. Ethan, Emily, and she needed to know what this all meant for their family. As strange as it was, these four strangers, these half-siblings, had become a part of their story. When Laura entered the small conference room, she saw Ethan and Emily sitting at the table, their faces filled with curiosity and a bit of uncertainty. They, too, had spent days grappling with the idea that they now had four brothers they had never known existed. They had questions just as much as she did. Soon, the four men walked in. Ethan, Michael, Jacob, and Lucas. All of them looked so much like William, and yet they were complete strangers. They didn't look angry or resentful. In fact, they looked nervous, almost as if they were equally unsure about what to expect from this meeting. Laura took a deep breath and spoke first. "I know this is a lot for all of us to process. We don't have all the answers yet, but I think it's time to start figuring this out together. I want to hear what you have to say." Ethan, the oldest of the group, nodded. "We all want the same thing, to understand who we are, where we come from, and why we've never known about each other. And of course, why our father never reached out." "I'm sorry," Laura said, her voice soft. "I wish I could give you the answers you need. But William, your father, left without a word, and we've all been left wondering ever since." Michael, who had been quiet so far, spoke up. "We're not here to blame anyone. We just want to understand the man who helped bring us into this world, even if he wasn't there. We've all had questions about our past, and now we're finally getting some of the answers." Laura nodded. "I understand. I never expected this either. After everything that happened, I thought it was just over. But now we have to deal with this new reality, and I'm willing to try." The four young men looked at each other, exchanging glances that spoke volumes. They were all eager to understand, to connect, and yet there was a lot of uncertainty in the room. They had spent their entire lives without knowing each other, and now they were all thrust into this situation with the hope of finding some form of family. Jacob cleared his throat. "We've all been trying to make sense of what happened, and we know it wasn't any of our fault that things turned out this way. But there's still a lot we don't understand. How could he have just walked away? Why didn't he try to reach out to any of us?" Laura felt the sting of those words, but she knew they were questions she couldn't answer. "I don't have an explanation. I spent so many years wondering the same thing. All I can say is that he left, And now, we're here, together, trying to make sense of everything. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't filled with blame. There was an unspoken understanding among them all. They were all struggling, and yet they were willing to try. "I think it's time we all get to know each other better," Lucas said, breaking the silence. "We might have different lives, different experiences, but we share something important. We share a father. Maybe we don't have the answers yet, but we can start by getting to know each other." Laura smiled faintly, feeling a small spark of hope. "You're right. We may not know everything, but we can begin to understand each other. And that's a start." The conversation shifted, slowly becoming less about the past and more about the present. They talked about their lives, their experiences, their interests. Ethan shared his love for history. Michael talked about his work in photography. Jacob mentioned his passion for writing, and Lucas spoke about his dreams of traveling. In those moments, something unexpected began to happen. The four strangers, who had once seemed like complete strangers, were starting to feel like a part of the family again. The shared bond of William had brought them together, but it was the willingness to open up and connect that was beginning to heal some of the wounds. As the meeting ended, Laura looked at the group with a sense of cautious hope. There was still so much to understand, and they had a long road ahead of them. But for the first time in years, it felt like they were moving forward, together. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet moments of reflection, some painful, others filled with tentative hope. Laura, Ethan, Emily, and the four young men, Ethan, Michael, Jacob, and Lucas, had continued to meet regularly. Slowly, the tension that had once filled the room had started to ease, replaced by a deeper understanding of each other. But while they had begun to connect, there was still much work to be done. Each meeting brought up new questions, new emotions, and more memories. For Laura, it was both a painful reminder of the life she had tried to move past and an opportunity to rebuild something she thought was lost forever. She had never imagined a day like this, where the man who had walked out on her would be replaced with not just one, but four faces she couldn't ignore. Ethan, now a young adult, began to engage more openly with the four men. He still carried some of the quiet, reserved nature he had developed growing up. But it was clear that he wanted to understand. He had spent his entire life with a void where his father should have been. And though it wasn't the ideal solution, meeting these men gave him a sense of closure he hadn't expected. Emily, too, started to open up more. She was still the firecracker she had always been, but her energy now seemed to be directed toward the new connections she was making. She asked questions, shared stories, and slowly began to let go of some of the bitterness she had held on to. There was still a part of her that wanted answers, wanted to understand why her father had never been there. But she found comfort in the knowledge that, in some small way, he was still a part of her life through the four brothers. And as for the four men, they too found themselves grappling with the complexities of their situation. Ethan, Michael, Jacob, and Lucas had each experienced life in their own way, shaped by different families and different paths. They had grown up with the knowledge that they were missing something, but none of them had ever imagined it would lead to this. The conversations became less about blame and more about understanding. They shared their stories, where they had come from, the challenges they had faced growing up without a father, and how they had dealt with the sense of abandonment. Each of them had their own struggles, their own battles with feeling out of place, and yet they found common ground in the shared absence of William. One evening, after one of their long discussions, Laura sat quietly in the living room with her children. Ethan had already gone to bed, but Emily was still awake, flipping through an old photo album. Laura watched her, her heart heavy with a mix of emotion. "Mom," Emily said quietly, looking up from the album, "do you think Dad would be proud of us?" Laura smiled softly, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I know that you've made me proud every single day." Emily nodded, the sadness in her eyes replaced by something else. Hope. "I think he would be proud of us too, even if he wasn't around to see it." Laura took a deep breath. I think you're right. Later that night, the four young men, sitting together over coffee, reflected on how far they had come. They had started as strangers, thrown together by a past none of them fully understood. But now, they were more than just connected by blood. They were learning to be family. We may never know all the answers, Jacob said quietly, but I think we found something important. We found each other. The others nodded, understanding the depth of what he was saying. They didn't need to fix everything. They didn't need to change the past, but they had each other now, and that was a start. As Laura sat down to join them, she realized something important. Life wasn't about erasing the past or forgetting the mistakes made. It was about learning to move forward, even when things weren't perfect. And in that moment, surrounded by these people who had once been strangers but were now family, Laura felt a sense of peace. They had faced the past, and though they would never forget it, they had learned to build something new together. It wasn't the family she had once imagined, but it was a family nonetheless. And that, she realized, was enough.